Alright, imagine this. You're checking your personal bank account. You see a negative balance. You owe over $34 trillion. Not billion, trillion. Now imagine that balance keeps growing every year. And instead of cutting back, you keep spending more. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's not just fiction. It's the reality for many countries around the world, from Japan to Italy to the United States. Today, we're focusing on the US, where the national debt has surpassed $34 trillion and is rising by the second. But how did it get here? Why does the richest country on earth owe so much money? And who, exactly, does it owe it to? Let's dive into the complex, controversial, and often misunderstood world of national debt, government borrowing, and why it's not just the US problem, but one many nations face today. What is the national debt, exactly? Let's break it down. The national debt is the total amount of money the US federal government has borrowed over time and hasn't paid back. That includes money borrowed to cover annual deficits, when spending exceeds revenue, interest on previous debt, and new borrowing to finance things like wars, tax cuts, healthcare, and economic bailouts. The debt is made up of two parts. Public debt, money the government owes to external creditors like individuals, foreign governments, banks, pension funds. Intergovernmental debt, money the government owes to itself, like borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund. Together, it adds up to one of the largest piles of IOUs in human history. How did it get so high? The US didn't rack up trillions overnight. It took decades, and a lot of spending. Here are some of the biggest reasons. Wars, from World War II to Iraq and Afghanistan, wars cost billions, even trillions. Tax cuts, lowering taxes means less revenue coming in, even if spending doesn't go down. Recessions, economic downturns lead to stimulus packages and bailouts. COVID-19, the pandemic triggered massive government spending to keep the economy afloat. In fact, between 2020 and 2022 alone, the US added over $6 trillion to the debt. And every year, if the government spends more than it earns in taxes, it borrows the difference. That yearly shortfall is called the federal deficit. The national debt is the total of all those deficits added together. Who does the US owe all this money to? This part surprises a lot of people. Contrary to popular belief, most of the debt is owed to Americans. Yes, American banks, investors, pension funds, and even the Federal Reserve hold U.S. Treasury bonds. But about 30% of the U.S. debt is held by foreign countries, including China, around $850 billion, Japan, over $1 trillion, the UK, Luxembourg, and other financial hubs. These countries buy U.S. debt because it's considered safe and stable. U.S. Treasury bonds are like the gold standard of global investing. They offer low risk, steady returns, and a massive market. So in a way, the U.S. is like a global borrower with really good credit. Wait, why can't the U.S. just print more money? It's tempting, right? Why not just print a few $1 trillion and pay it all off? Because that would cause inflation to explode. Money only has value if it's scarce and trusted. If the government floods the system with new dollars, prices skyrocket. We've seen this happen before. Zimbabwe, where inflation hit 89.76%. Venezuela, with collapsing currency and economic chaos. Germany in the 1920s, when people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. The US does create money, but only in careful, controlled ways, mostly through the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. Just printing your way out of debt? That's a one-way ticket to economic disaster. Is having debt always a bad thing? Not necessarily. Debt isn't evil. In fact, borrowing can be smart, if you use the money wisely. Businesses borrow to expand. Homeowners borrow to buy property. Governments borrow to build infrastructure, fund education, and respond to emergencies. If debt fuels growth, it can be a positive investment. The key is, can you pay it back? And that brings us to a crucial measure: the debt-to-GDP ratio. This compares how much a country owes versus how much it produces. Right now, the US debt is over 120% of GDP. That's more than the entire economy makes in a year. Some economists say this is sustainable, for now. Others warn we're playing with fire. So what happens if we don't pay it back? Let's be clear, the US has never defaulted on its debt. Ever. Why? Because doing so would be catastrophic. If the US ever failed to make interest payments, global markets would panic. Borrowing costs would skyrocket. Confidence in the dollar would collapse. This is why debates over the debt ceiling, the legal cap on how much the government can borrow, are such a big deal. Every time Congress fights over raising it, there's a risk of default. Even threatening not to raise it can rattle global markets. So far, the US has always found a way to raise the ceiling and keep paying its bills. But the long-term concern is real. Because even if we never default, the interest alone is becoming a monster. The interest time bomb. Here's a scary stat. In 2025, or 2026, depending on future budget changes, the US is projected to spend more on interest payments. Let that sink in. Just paying interest on the debt will cost over $1 trillion per year, and rising. That's money that isn't going to education, healthcare, or infrastructure. It's just keeping the debt machine running. If interest rates stay high or rise even more, the debt becomes even harder to manage. It's like maxing out your credit card and only paying the minimum, forever. Why doesn't the government just cut spending or raise taxes? The million or trillion dollar question. The truth is, either option is politically easy. Cutting spending means slashing popular programs like Medicare, Social Security, or military funding. Raising taxes is, well, never a crowd pleaser. And here's the kicker: both parties have contributed to the debt. Republicans tend to support tax cuts and military spending. Democrats tend to support social programs and economic stimulus. But both sides run deficits, and the debt keeps growing, no matter who's in charge. Why? Because cutting spending or raising revenue often means making unpopular decisions that can cost votes. So the can gets kicked down the road, again and again. Does this make the US weak or vulnerable? Not exactly. Ironically, the US debt is so massive because people trust the US economy. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. US debt is still in high demand. And America still has a huge, innovative economy. So in the short term, the US can keep borrowing. But long term? A ballooning debt could weaken the country's flexibility, increase financial risk, and leave future generations with a tab they didn't run up. Can we ever pay it all off? Short answer? Probably not. And maybe that's okay. Most economists agree that the goal isn't zero debt. It's manageable debt. Think of it like a mortgage. You don't have to pay it off tomorrow, but you need to keep it under control. That means growing the economy, keeping interest payments reasonable, and making sure debt doesn't spiral out of proportion. In other words, treat national debt like a powerful tool, not a bottomless credit card. So why does the US owe so much money? Because for decades, it's spent more than it earns, borrowed to fill the gap, and promised more than it could deliver. Often for good reasons, sometimes for political ones. The debt is big. It's real. And it's growing. But the real danger? Is not having a plan. If you found this deep dive into debt, dollars, and decisions eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever wondered how a country can owe trillions and still keep spending. And here's a question for the comments. Do you think national debt is a ticking time bomb, or just the cost of doing business in the modern world? Until next time, stay curious, keep asking the big questions, and remember, economics isn't just about numbers, it's about how we live, lead, and shape the future.